I don't care for the word threat for two reasons. One is that it implies that Israel is likely to attack the United States, which is not true. The fact is that Israel is a huge albatross around our neck, and it causes us enormous damage in the foreign policy realm. The second problem I have with the word threat is that it implies that it's something that's out there on the horizon and hasn't hit us yet. And the fact is that Israel has been an albatross around our neck for a long time. And let me just give you a couple examples of that. Let's talk about 9/11, the Iraq War, and the Iran War. Although few people in the United States know it, the fact is that 9/11 was due in large part to our relationship with Israel. You want to understand that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is the principal architect of the attacks, is now at Guantanamo, has said that it was Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and America's close relationship with Israel that motivated him to attack the United States. With regard to Osama bin Laden, it's important to understand that he tried to move up the date of the attack two times before September 11th, 2001, because of events involving Israel. In the summer of 2000, when Ariel Sharon, who was then prime minister of Israel, was going to visit the Temple Mount, this so exercised Osama bin Laden that he tried to move up the attack to the summer of 2000. Of course, that didn't happen. And then in the summer of 2001, I think it was either June or July, there were reports that Sharon was coming to the White House to meet with the president. And then again, Osama bin Laden tried to move up the date. So you can see that Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who were the two principal forces behind 9/11, were deeply motivated by Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and our support for Israel. With regard to the Iraq War, it's commonplace today to say that, yes, Israel is in large part responsible for dragging President Trump into this disastrous war, but that was not the case with regard to the Iraq War. That is simply not true. Anybody who has any doubts about that, or to take a look at the chapter in the book that Steve Walt and I wrote on the Israel lobby, where we detail at great lengths the efforts that the lobby and Israel itself made to drag us into that disastrous war. So when you think about 9/11, Iraq, and Iran, I believe without Israel, none of those three things would have happened. Then you have to face up to the fact that today, given what's going on in the Middle East, we are damaging our position all around the world because we're in this losing war that's causing great damage to our reputation and also using up all sorts of munitions that we need in other scenarios, especially in East Asia, for the purposes of containing China. This war that Israel is principally responsible for dragging us into against Iran, is hurting us greatly in East Asia. And then there's the whole subject of the genocide. The United States is complicit in a genocide. Now, there's no question that we have agency here, but the fact is that we were dragged into this conflict in large part because of the power of the lobby and the fact that the lobby was able to get us to support Israel no matter what after October 7th. And that brings up the whole subject of the lobby. We're talking about Israel and whether it's a strategic asset or not, or whether it's a strategic threat or not, to use your rhetoric. But you have to get inside the United States and think about what the consequences are of having this lobby that has so much power. Is it a force for good inside the United States, or is it not? The fact is that the principal threat to freedom of speech in the United States today is the Israel lobby. There's just no question about that. You come to university campuses or college campuses, we all understand that you're at great risk if you speak out loud against Israel or against the Israel lobby. Just go back to the spring of 2024 when you had all those protests against the genocides in Gaza on college and university campuses. They've completely disappeared. The government cracked down and ended that. The government made it clear that anybody who criticized Israel was going to get into serious trouble, maybe even deported in some cases. So Israel is the Israel lobby, of course, which is joined at the hip with Israel, is a major threat to freedom of speech in the United States. Then there's our elections, as everybody knows. AIPAC and these other institutions in the lobby, they distort our elections. They distort our hiring process. You ought to ask Chaz Freeman sometime about what happened to him when the lobby made it almost impossible. No, I take that back. The lobby made it impossible for him to ever occupy an important position inside the government because he had been critical of Israel. I could go on and on. But it's terribly important for Americans to understand that our relationship with Israel is not good at all from a strategic point of view. And what's going on inside the United States with the lobby is a threat to liberal democracy.
How about espionage? I mean, is it fair to say that while Prime Minister Netanyahu was speaking with President Trump, and I'm going to argue and ask you if you agree in a few minutes, if he left the White House empty-handed, his comments and the president's comments were being surveilled in the White House by Mossad?
I don't know that for a fact. I wouldn't be sure. I wouldn't be surprised at all. But if Netanyahu was in the room talking to Trump, they wouldn't have much need to surveil what was being said because Netanyahu could hear it with his own ears. But there's no question, talk to anybody in the intelligence community, that there's no country on the planet that spies more on us than Israel does. And then you have incidents like the Jonathan Pollard case. If you look carefully at the Jonathan Pollard case, it's actually quite shocking. Pollard did significant damage to American national security. And the lobby went to great lengths, and this includes Sheldon Adelson, to get him out of jail and allow him to go to Israel, where was treated or is treated like a conquering hero. The idea that Israel is this strategic asset and it does all these wonderful things for us is a laughable argument. Again, it is a major strategic liability.
How dangerous to United States sovereignty is this Trump-supported legislation that would effectively amalgamate the Pentagon and the IDF, the CIA and the Mossad?
It's actually shocking. And it's not only the legislation itself that is shocking. It's the fact that nobody in the national security community today, or anyone who occupied an important position in the past, has spoken up and said that this should be categorically unacceptable. The United States of America should not be in a relationship with Israel that basically compromises its independence and gives real power to Israel on important national security issues like that. Again, it just shows you the extent to which the lobby influences policymaking in the United States.
Haaretz, the Israeli publication, which produces an English version, which you and I regularly consult, says that Netanyahu left the White House the other day. The day was there ostensibly for Senator Lindsey Graham's funeral, empty-handed. When he arrived at Dulles Airport, no American officials greeted him. When he left, no American officials bid him farewell. What was he looking for that he left empty-handed, that he doesn't already have?
I would also note that he had difficulty getting a meeting with Trump. Trump had been trying to avoid him. Moreover, that he came in a side door at the White House and went out a side door at the White House. And as we all know, there was no press conference. In the past, when the two of them got together, they would have a big press conference afterwards where they would say wonderful things about each other, wonderful things about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, and it would be all smiles. That was obviously not the case this time. And I think in a very important way, Trump is fed up with Netanyahu. He knows that Netanyahu led him into this disastrous war. And I'm sure that Trump would like to make Netanyahu pay for that. But I think what's going on here is that Netanyahu wanted to meet with the president because it would help his chances of getting reelected in the upcoming elections in Israel. I mean, I think what Benjamin Netanyahu has been very good at doing in the past and wants to convey that he has been good at this and will be able to do it in the future is coming to the United States and manipulating the American political system in ways that are favorable to Israel. I mean, he is a brilliant politician. And when it comes to working the American political system, he's probably better than any American politician. So what he wanted to do was come and show that he was still friends with President Trump. He could get an audience. And then he could say after the meeting that it was the best meeting I've ever had with the president.
And that's what he told Fox News on the evening of Senator Graham's funeral. It was the best conversation I ever had with Trump. And Professor Mearsheimer, not a word from the White House and not a word from Trump about this best conversation.
But we know Trump well enough at this point to understand that after what's happened in Iran, and given the fact that it was the Israelis, David Barnea and Benjamin Netanyahu, who told him that this escapade was going to work out swimmingly, that Trump, as a result of how it has actually turned out, is surely irate with Netanyahu and wants nothing to do with him. And I bet if Trump could figure out a way to punish Netanyahu, he would jump at the opportunity. But of course, he can't do that.
Right. Retired IDF General Yitzhak Brick, B-R-I-K. I don't know of him. Chaz Freeman knew him and Ritter knows him. Said 2 days ago, Iran can crush us. Why would he have said that?
Well, I think that he fully understands that Iran has a huge inventory of very accurate and very deadly ballistic missiles and drones that it can launch at Israel. And Israel has a limited number of interceptors that can knock down those incoming ballistic missiles and drones. And by the way, the United States, which has played a key role in helping to defend Israel, this was true back in the 12-day war in June of 2025, and it's true in the 40-day bombing campaign earlier in this war. The United States is no longer in a position where it has missiles that it can expend in large numbers to defend Israel. So Israel is not completely defenseless, but it's close to being defenseless. And it's a small country, and there are not that many targets that the Iranians would have to hit to do massive destruction to Israel. So Israel is in a very vulnerable position. You'll notice that we recently had, I think it took place from about July 7th to July 31st, this tit-for-tat war. It was the only real fighting between the United States and Iran since the 40-day bombing campaign that started the war. Remember, we had a 40-day bombing campaign from February 28th to April 8th. And then there was a ceasefire. And the only breakdown in the ceasefire of any consequence since then was this tit-for-tat campaign, which I just described in July. The Israelis sat on the sidelines the entire time. The Israelis had no interest in getting back in the fight. And I don't blame the Israelis at all. The Israelis were willing to pass the buck to us. The Israelis made all sorts of demands that we do this and we do that with the Iranians, but they did not want to enter the fight. And they did not want to enter the fight because they understand that General Brick is correct.
No, let's go to Russia. What do you see happening in Ukraine in the next months, say between now and the end of the year? And does this change of mind of this podcaster, influencer, even though she has the presidency, or is that going to change policy?
Well, let's talk about what's going on in the war in Ukraine. I think it's quite clear that things have been moving quite swiftly in Russia's favor over the course of this summer. The first point I would make is that if you look at the air war, the Ukrainians have no more Patriot missiles to use to defend Ukraine against the swarms of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones that the Russians are launching at them. It's almost the case that Ukraine is defenseless. And what's happened is that not only are the Russians destroying all sorts of critical infrastructure across the country, critical infrastructure that's important for waging the war, but most importantly, they have shut down Odessa and all of the major ports on the Black Sea. And they have turned Ukraine into a landlocked country. This is having and going to have enormous economic consequences because about 90% of all agricultural goods exported by the Ukrainians go through the Odessa ports. There are three ports there, 90%. And about 75% of manufactured goods and agricultural goods, 75% go through the Odessa ports. And we know from what happened between February 2022, that's when the war started, and July 2022, we know what happened during those few months when Odessa was basically shut down and Ukraine could not export goods through those ports, that the Ukrainian economy suffered greatly. So if you read the reports from inside Ukraine about what's happening now as a consequence of Odessa being shut down, of Ukraine becoming a landlocked country, it's quite clear that this is going to have catastrophic economic consequences. And you want to remember that this is all happening at the same time there is a huge political crisis inside of Ukraine. Zelensky has just fired his commanding general, General Syrskyi, and he's also fired his defense minister. This is not the sort of thing you want to be doing in the middle of a war, especially when you're being hammered by the Russians.
Right.
And then on top of all that, if you look at what's happening up on the front lines, the Ukrainians are in great trouble. There's no question that the Russians are making slow advances. They're not racing across Ukraine like panzer divisions raced across France in World War II. That's not happening here. The Russians are moving very slowly. But the fact is that the Ukrainian army is in desperate straits. First of all, Ukraine has a much smaller population than Russia does. And unsurprisingly, now that both sides have mobilized their forces on both sides, I would estimate that the Russians have somewhere on the order of a 3-to-1 advantage in combat troops over the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians, as we know from Ukrainian officials themselves, have a huge problem with draft dodging. They estimate that there are 2 million draft dodgers in Ukraine, and they have a huge problem with soldiers running away from the front, the AWOL problem. They estimate, and again, this is the former Ukrainian defense minister in January of this year, estimating that there are 200,000 soldiers who are AWOL.
Wow.
When you're badly outnumbered to begin with, and you're up against the Russian steamroller, 200,000 AWOL soldiers is real trouble. So I think there's no question that when you look at what's happening on the battlefield and you look at the air war, and especially when you look at what's happening with regard to Odessa and the Black Sea ports and the fact that Ukraine is now landlocked, you understand that there's no way Ukraine can win this war. The Russians are going to win the war. They're going to win an ugly victory. And the only interesting question is when that happens.
Before we leave, I want to go back to Iran. Press TV, which is the Iranian state television, ran a fascinating interview with an Iranian major general. I don't know who he is or where he fits in the hierarchy, but a major general, as you know, is fairly significant. He made some very interesting comments about Donald Trump and American leadership, and I'd like your thoughts on it. Chris, cut number 9.
The fundamental problem that Donald Trump has, in my personal opinion, is that there is this significant and noticeable shortage of both genuine wisdom and sound prudence. I mean, practically speaking, he's got issues. When you consider the 12-day war, the 40-day and 17-day wars, you see that the level of decision-making in America has kind of reduced. I mean, the prudence that they had during the First War, we don't see that among the American commanders. I mean, they planned to separate the southern part of Iran from the northern part. This is non-military. I mean, this is not feasible. It's been non-professional. I mean, such planning. On what basis did you have such a plan? This shows this degradation.
Mental degradation.
Look, it's hard to disagree with him. If you think about the planning process or the decision-making process inside the White House, it is, by all accounts, helter-skelter. And it's that way for one very simple reason. President Trump thinks he's a genius, and he basically flies by the seat of his pants. In other words, if he's deciding whether or not to do X or Y or Z, he doesn't task his National Security Council to do an extensive study of the options and advise him on which option makes the best sense. He basically does what he thinks is the best option, or he pursues what he thinks is the best option. And the fact is, he doesn't have a lot of strategic wisdom. First of all, every person has real limits. Even somebody like me, or many of the people who you have on your show who've thought about these issues for almost all of their life, are sometimes dead wrong. And the reason that you want to staff problems, the reason that you want people to study an issue before you go forward with a particular policy, is because you may not understand the correct solution to the problem that you face.
Right.
Everybody's fallible. He has no sense that he's fallible. He thinks he's a genius. He thinks he doesn't have to listen to other people. So you have no meaningful planning process, and he just flies by the seat of his pants. Go back to the decision to start the Iran war. It was quite clear that almost all of his advisors, as we've talked about before on the show, thought it was a very bad idea. J.D. Vance, the head of the CIA, General Kane, the Secretary of State. But nevertheless, he ignored what they had to say. And instead, what he did was listen to what Benjamin Netanyahu and David Barnea, the head of Mossad at the time, said. He thought they were right. That was his basic instinct. Right. And he thought that they had a clever strategy that would produce a great victory. I would think if you're contemplating going to war against Iran in a major league way, you're talking about toppling the regime in Iran, you would want to staff that problem. You would want to ask your national security apparatus to study the issue carefully, tell you what the different options are, what the pros and cons are, and then make a careful decision. But that's the exact opposite of what happened, right? What happened is he just flew by the seat of his pants. And the end result is he got into this disastrous war.